So we've covered batting runs as part of WAR. We've considered base running runs as part of WAR. Now we consider fielding as part of the positional player total value that we're trying to measure with wins above replacement. So we talked about fielding in Module 4, and these days the data coming from Baseball Info Solutions drives most of the advanced fielding metrics that are used for WAR calculations. Fangraphs uses UZR in their WAR calculation for fielding runs. Baseball Reference uses defensive runs saved as their fielding runs. And for seasons beyond the data from BIS being part of WAR, total zone is used. These metrics are all briefly described in Module 4. So that's the basis of fielding runs that we're going to measure for positional players. But there's a problem here relative to the way we did base running runs and batting runs. The way these metrics work is they compare to the average fielder at that position, not to the average fielder overall. And that's a little different than batting runs or base running runs. So you need to adjust for the positional difficulty after you give runs to the fielders. So you give runs to fielders by position, and then you adjust for the positional difficulty after those runs have been assigned. Now, this positional difficulty is an important concept, and maybe this example will help student learners understand it better. If you took the average shortstop in the major leagues and moved them over to second base, they probably would be an above average second baseman. Shortstop's a harder position than second base, so the more difficult fielding position moving over to the easier field position should make them above average. Same thing in the outfield. If you took the average left fielder in Major League Baseball, the average defensive left fielder, and you moved them to center field, they'd all of a sudden be below average, because the fielding skills of the center fielder on average are higher than the fielding skills of the left fielder. So this positional difficulty is sort of described by the movement of players to different positions. And we can actually study that. Positional adjustments come from research, and they're found through players who've played multiple positions. In other words, they looked at players who played both shortstop and second. And they looked at players who played different positions in the outfield, left, center, and right field. And based on their fielding runs at each of the positions they played in, you can sort of start to estimate how difficult any given position is. So you take the average shortstop. Of all the average shortstops in Major League Baseball who spent time at second base, you can start comparing the defensive run value of those players while at short versus while they're at second. Let's say, for example, we looked at the data and we saw that the shortstop who switched to second all of a sudden was a plus 10 run defender at second base. We would make sure that the adjustment difference between second and short in our positional adjustments would be 10 runs. Now, we can do this for all different positions. We can start comparing positions across the field. And for those students who really want to learn more about this, the article titled "Did Derek Jeter Deserve the Gold Glove?" in Baseball Between the Numbers, written by James Click, describes this study very well. He does a nice study just like this, looking for positional adjustments in the difficulty of the various positions on the field. But it's not an exact science. You can imagine that a player who's played shortstop their whole life, moving to another position like third base or the outfield, is going to have an adjustment period. They aren't trained for those positions. There's also a selection bias because the players moving positions aren't necessarily the average players. They might be slightly below average, the player that's moving around. The experience is what I was referring to before. Players have different experience levels at different positions, and this might impact this research study in positional adjustments. There's also a problem with lefty and righty throwers. There's positions on the field that don't really allow left-handed throwers, particularly second, short, and third. You don't see left-handed throwers at those positions, so there's no real comparison for a player who throws left-handed. And since catcher is such a difficult position and so highly trained, catchers don't really swap positions as much as other players. Let's look at these positional adjustments. These are runs that we would adjust the defensive runs that a player earns based on the position that they play. In other words, if they're a catcher, since catcher is such a hard position, we're going to add 12.5 runs to the players who play catcher because of the difficulty of the position. We're going to give them that many runs just because they play catcher. That's the positional adjustment. Any position with a positive number here is a more difficult position on the field. Any position here with a negative number is an easier position on the field. It's an important thing to note and keep in mind that different positions have different difficulties and therefore different positional adjustments. So let's go to Adrian Beltre. He's our example through this series of videos. In 2004, Adrian Beltre was a terrific fielder. His UZR, his defensive runs, was 25.5. That's an outstanding defensive year. He had a great year on defense. And then he had a 2.3 positional adjustment. Now this isn't the normal 2.5 positional adjustment you get by being a third baseman. But since he didn't play 100% of the time on defense for the Dodgers, he only played 92% of the time. We don't give him the full positional adjustment. The positional adjustment is divided up among all the players who played that position for that team. So that's why it's only a 2.3 bump by playing third base, where normally the third baseman gets a 2.5 run bump because of position. So we've described fielding runs, base running runs, and batting runs in our attempt to get a full look at the total value of a player, a positional player, towards winning baseball games, towards creating runs for the team.